Hello, everyone. This is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm joined by Reija from the book Finch.
Hello.
And we're going to be discussing the book White Rage by Carol Anderson. We buddy read this a month or two ago, and we were really impressed by everything that it had to say. This book has so much content talking about the ways that people in power, in particular white people, have fought against all progress that the Black community has made through a lot of oppression and laws. And really, from the Reconstruction era to the modern era, kind of breaks it down, telling us about all of those legislation acts and just really ways that white people have reacted with rage to Black progress. So we're going to go ahead and talk about the main ideas that Anderson presents in each section of the book. The book is broken up into 5 chapters, taking a look at different eras in U.S. history from the Reconstruction era until the present, and really looking at the ways that white rage has manifested. So it starts with chapter 1, looking at the Reconstruction era. This is what happened after the Civil War ended, when the South was supposed to be reconstructing. So there were a lot of efforts to make it so that the freed slaves could be basically integrated into society. There were a bunch of amendments made to the U.S. Constitution. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which granted the right to vote. So all of these, plus things like the Freedmen's Bureau, which was supposed to provide resources, land, education to the people who had been freed, were attempts to really help all of these people who had previously been enslaved become full citizens, become people who had rights. And the pushback against this was enormous. It was really, really awful. This chapter just laid it out fact by fact by fact, the way that people who were in power fought against this. So one of the big things that happened was that during Reconstruction, you would have expected the South to be reconstructed. And instead, the president of the US at that time, Andrew Johnson, was from the South, and he sympathized very heavily with white Southerners. So he basically just set everything back up the way it was before the war. He reinstated power to all of the Confederate leaders. They stayed the people who were in Congress, who were the governors, who were the judges, which meant that it was very, very hard for any real change to occur. And instead, there was a lot of backlash against all of the Black community in the South. It was really, really bad. And Andrew Johnson himself was somebody who really didn't want to support any legislation that was supporting the Black community because he felt like that was taking away from white people. So really a very racist president who undermined all of the efforts of Reconstruction and all of those amendments, which meant that the South then went ahead and basically re-established slavery by another name. So a lot of the Southern states created things called Black Codes, which were a lot of laws that were essentially slavery. They did things like say, all Black people must be employed. They do not have a choice as to who employs them. They do not have a choice as to whether or not to be employed. If you're unemployed, you will be arrested for vagrancy. And you just basically have to be enslaved again. It's just that they might pay you some sort of minimum wage. It was just basically slavery again. And even though there were a lot of people fighting legal battles against this kind of thing, the Supreme Court was still heavily racist and kind of struck down all of these things. So there were so many legal challenges to what was going on in the South during Reconstruction era, and all of these violations of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. The Supreme Court, in so many cases, just case after case, which are all detailed in this book, they struck down the kind of power of these amendments. They basically eviscerated them by saying, no, states' rights are more important than the federal government's ability to enforce these laws. And so they said, if a state chooses to enforce these amendments, then that's fine, but the federal government has no right. And they basically made ruling after ruling that limited Black people's ability to vote with polling taxes or literacy tests, these sorts of things, allowed discrimination in terms of accommodation and access to public things, eliminated access to juries for Black people. I mean, ruling after ruling. It is intense, the number of ways that the Supreme Court undermined the 13th through 15th Amendments in this chapter. And it's really disturbing, but very powerful to read this chapter.
So I would just like to add that the reason why the South managed to get away with and make these legal maneuvers was because of the loophole in the 13th Amendment, which states that while slavery is illegal, you can technically have slaves if they are incarcerated, because a person who commits a crime and is then punished for it and incarcerated, basically their citizenship rights can be revoked for a period of time. And this was something that was heavily, like Black people were penalized constantly during the Black Codes and up to the Jim Crow era. You have these chain gangs, and people would be arrested for vagrancy and for trumped up charges, such as, like, for example, just looking at a white woman or something, and they would just be charged with these made up crimes or petty crimes that they wouldn't charge white people with. And then that would give them access to free labor, because they could then take these imprisoned people and rent them out, so to speak, to plantation owners. So practically the only thing that the South reconstructed was their slave economy.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. Just that they found a way to use the laws and to fight against the laws and to use loopholes in the laws to just allow them to continue with what they had already been doing. So that's a good point.
I would also say that there was this interesting talking point in the first chapter, where, because the Southern leaders were basically just given slaps on the wrist and they were allowed to go back to Congress and get a seat in Parliament again, there was this interesting dynamic that the Northerners were basically walking on eggshells around Southern representatives, and people in the South had a vehement anger and hatred towards the Union members because they had lost civil war. So you have this weird dynamic where the Southerners can basically do nothing wrong and they can get away with things with impunity, and they have then no respect for any ruling that comes from the Northern representatives, because why should they? They have no reason to believe that any of it will come to harm them. There was one quote that said that, "Don't worry, Andrew Johnson is for us." So the second chapter goes over the Great Migration, the period of time when Black people were basically escaping the South to go to the northern states, where there were more job opportunities, more housing opportunities, and just basically an uptick in life expectancy, because the South at this point was a toxic hellscape for Black people. There were things like rampant lynchings, spectacle lynchings. The book has a quote that says that the lynchings became a sort of white man's rite of passage, where people would bring children to these events, and they would be like sort of crowd pleasing events, and nobody did anything. There was no punishment for these people, and they didn't have to hide anything. They were very much open about it. And the chapter then goes to show that while the migration was happening, the Southerners then became increasingly worried about the state of their economy because all of their free labor was suddenly going away and taking trains and smuggling themselves out of the States in order to lead a better life. And then they went on with another barrage of legislation to limit the access of the Black people to train tickets, to work opportunities. They made it a crime to solicit workers, basically headhunt people, that headhunters could be charged with crimes. And this meant that the people who wanted to escape these states had to become increasingly secretive and increasingly careful about how they would go about removing themselves from that situation.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things too in this book was when it talked about how surprised the people in the South were that Black people wanted to leave. There was just this feeling of, but what? Why would they want to leave? We like them where they are. And it kind of actually reminds me of what's happening now with the Black Lives Matter protests that just broke out in June, where people are like, why are people so angry? And it's like this complete, I don't know, ignorance, willful ignorance, this belief that I'm happy with the situation. So why aren't you? Why would you not be happy with living in terror and, being basically worked into slave labor? Because I'm happy with it. And it's just like, it was just so interesting to read that.
I would also say that part of it is definitely due to indifference and lack of empathy. Like these people, like they really did not see Black people as equals. And I'm gonna be frank here. I think that's, at least for some people, the case even today.
Yeah.
And people just don't want to admit it, and they want to be covert about it. But I think that's where the cookie crumbles, so to speak.
And I think that point is the point of the book, right? That it still continues till today. People don't want to admit that it still continues till today, but it does. And I think that what each of these chapters in this book is doing is showing, well, this is the history of how it has worked. And also, it continues to work this way. Even things like you said, where lynching was this rite of passage for white men. Here's the thing. There are still white supremacist groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, where literally killing a Black person is the rite of initiation. And so maybe it's gone more underground in some ways, but so much of this hatred and this rage against any sort of rights and progress for the Black community still continues. It's just that when you look at the historical context and you look at how open people were about that hatred, it's shocking. And I think what Anderson is really trying to get you to realize is that it's shocking, but it continues to be shocking as well.
I also want to add that we see this shift that we probably will be talking about in the later chapters, but this idea of that hatred and racism sort of becoming more covert. When it becomes socially unacceptable, people then start to hide it and veil it in another kind of language. And then we get into the whole idea of dog whistles and stuff like that, that people will understand what you mean, but you don't really say what you mean out in the open. And then we also see this shift where it becomes more about not the individual supporting the system, but the system supporting the individual racism.
Yeah, and I think also another thing that this chapter touched on was sometimes you think, oh, well, it's just those extremists, right? But the thing is, it's the whole system, it's everybody. And so like this chapter talked about the Great Migration, and yeah, everything was bad in the South, but when people went north, it was bad too. I mean, this book had some really heart-wrenching anecdotes of what happened to Black people who decided that they deserved to have a house, these sorts of things, and the white neighbors who very much reacted strongly against that. And just the idea that it's a system, it's not just a few individual bad people, it's everybody's buying into this idea of racism and how that affected Black people kind of wherever they went. So next is chapter 3. And chapter 3 really talks about the Jim Crow era segregation of education. Education is something that was a big battle because education was so important for changing the kind of socioeconomic status of so many people in Black communities, but it was also something that white people really did not want to allow any access to. So in the sort of Jim Crow era, what happened was that there was this idea of separate but equal, which really meant that white people could have their own things, their own schools, which had separate funding from that which was directed to Black schools. And that led to a great disparity in funding. So Black schools in the South were getting maybe a third of the funding that white schools were getting. And this meant that there was a lot of overcrowding. Students sometimes would only be able to do half-day schooling because the schools would have to create sort of a double booking of students. Or they would have these schools that had no electricity, no plumbing. You'd have just horrible teacher-to-student ratios. There would sometimes be no high schools at all in Black communities. So the schools were very much separate and very much not equal. The NAACP was working really, really hard to make sure that there was equality or that there was integration. And so they were fighting lots of battles at this time, sort of in the first half and the middle of the 20th century. And they were doing so many different things that the southern states started really pushing against that. So even though the NAACP was fighting a lot of very important legal battles, they were getting so much pushback from the South in terms of laws where they weren't allowed to offer legal counsel or financial support for people, or things where the states were demanding that they turn over their membership lists, which was a very dangerous thing for members because if those lists were turned over, then the people would face a lot of bad pushback, things like getting fired from their jobs or denied mortgages, these sorts of things. So the NAACP was getting a lot of pushback, but they kept fighting and they won a really important Supreme Court case, which you probably heard of, Brown v. Board of Education. And in that court case, the Supreme Court said, okay, yes, obviously these things are not equal and it does violate the Constitution, so the schools must integrate. And the white rage against the integration ruling was intense. There was even something called the Southern Manifesto, where the Southern states basically said, the federal government and Supreme Court have no rights over us. States' rights are way more important. We get to decide if something counts or not. And we do not want to integrate our schools. And they even blamed the Black community, saying, you guys care more about yourselves than you do about your children's education. And so we're going to push back. You get what you deserve. And they did so many things. So there was this huge pushback that's almost kind of like the cat biting off its nose to spite its face, where in the South, a lot of school districts said, we would rather close all of our schools than integrate. And a lot of school districts did this. It talked about Prince Edward County, which closed all of its schools for 5 years rather than integrate. A lot of other schools said, you know, can we get a delay? And so they asked for like decades-long delays on integration. And there was this other method too that a lot of these states had of avoiding integration, which was like school choice. So basically, it was this voucher system where the state would give money to private schools for those students, which meant that white students could go to private schools and get state funding for it. And of course, those private schools were not going to accept Black students. And so it allowed segregation to continue. So even though the fight against Jim Crow, even though the fight against segregation was being made, and even though the NAACP had won this court battle, the South for decades, and really even continuing until now, because school choice is still a thing in a lot of Southern states, fought against that and really did not want integration at any cost.
It's also interesting that the way that they did it was also basically suing every family that tried to fight the decisions, and because the longer they kept those cases in courthouses and in court, the longer they would have that grace period where they could segregate, because you couldn't act on a court decision which wasn't yet made. So it was in their interest to be in these prolonged legal battles and just be unrepentant assholes and just look at the law books and be like, yes, we can sue these people, or let them sue us. It is more beneficial for us to have these battles in court than to actually integrate. And there was this very interesting quote where a Southern representative said that as long as we can legislate, we can segregate. Yes. And that meant that they would, every time something would make some progress for Black people to gain their rights and gain their citizenship rights and go and have education and stuff, they would then employ legal measures and amendments to state laws in order to mitigate that progress. Yeah. And another thing that I found very interesting is in terms of how education and those education decisions regarding school integration and segregation in the 50s, 60s, 70s United States have led to a disproportionate amount of people without high school diplomas, people who don't pursue higher education because it is now not financially feasible for people. Those are things that have happened because of all those minor decisions that were made during those times that have now escalated into this crisis that is basically happening in the United States in terms of education. Because a lot of the jobs in the blue collar and logistics field are going to be automated. They are going to be jobs for robots basically in the next couple of years. It's like a lot of those jobs have already disappeared. So basically higher education would be a way out and would be a way to innovate and way to have more like scientists doing innovative field work in those areas, which is actually what the United States is currently lacking in. United States has a drought of scientific personnel, and that's why you have people like drafted from India, China, South Korea, and places to take those jobs because the United States can't give them to people living in the United States because they don't have enough graduates.
And it's just so frustrating when you look at it and you realize that this was a problem that was created intentionally that hurt so much of the US and so many people in the US, both Black and white, out of this rage, out of this white rage. And it's just very frustrating to see and to read all of these things and realize, like you said, how it continues to impact us until the modern day.
And it's interesting, like it's the equivalent of aiming a rifle at your foot and going, yeah, this is fine, and then pulling the trigger. And it just baffles me. And it's interesting because in my own country's experience after World War II, when the whole country was in shambles, our government made the Equal Education Act, which basically meant that the whole school system was revamped and made state funded. So there were no private schools, so that every single child could be given equal opportunity in learning and higher education and stuff. And that meant that people who were previously poor could then obtain jobs like be doctors and stuff. So like coming from that sort of background really shocked me to then read about these things, about this like thing that I consider a birthright and something so integral and important to your basic humanity and your basic like opportunity to succeed in life, to be so thoroughly dismantled and unvalued, basically, like devalued. Chapter 4 goes over the Reagan and Nixon era and how those administrations responded to the Civil Rights Movement and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And they did not respond well. During the Nixon era, we see the start of redefining history and redefining racism and what racism actually means. First of all, you have the whitewashing of the Civil War. It becomes more about freeing the slaves, and it becomes more about this glorious battle over the freedom of America and stuff, and it becomes sort of deified, despite the fact that you have the Black Coats and the Jim Crow after. You kind of start to see this switch in narrative where the Civil War technically ended slavery, and therefore we should not talk about anything that came after. And then you have this idea of redefining slavery as something covert. So it becomes, after the Civil Rights Movement, it becomes less accepted, to put it mildly, to be overtly racist. So people start using different language in order to get the same message across. So instead of using racial slurs, you might say that Black men are lazy, or they are pathologically criminal and they deserve to go to prison if they do crime and things like that. There have been many quotes from the Nixon era and Reagan era advisors actually describing this thing where they are basically creating a sort of dog whistle language where the right people will understand the meaning of what you are trying to say. And when you talk about housing and school district lines, the right people will then understand what you are really meaning by that, because when you are making those policies, they affect more Black people than they do white people. And during the Reagan era, you get the full-blown war on drugs and the actual pumping of crack cocaine into Black communities, which then begets this cycle of people having no other opportunities than to sell crack cocaine, which comes from suppliers that are backed by the government. And then the government will fight those drug dealers and incarcerate them and take back their citizenship rights and basically force them to do menial labor and hard labor while they are in prison. So Yeah.
Yeah, it was an upsetting chapter. It was upsetting because even though I think I understood the effect of the war on drugs and I understood that it was racially motivated, the intentionality of it was really laid bare in this chapter. For anybody who doesn't know, basically at this point, the Cold War was going on, and the Reagan administration wanted to kind of support some fighters in Central America who were battling against a socialist government. And so, since they couldn't get funding from Congress, they decided to kind of support a lot of drug dealers, drug trafficking into the US to get money there to send arms to these kind of people who were fighting against socialism in Central America. And so they 100% knew and supported. I mean, they really worked hard to get these drugs into the US, in particular into Black communities. And then they declare war on drugs. And in fact, the book talks about how actually the war on drugs was declared before the actual problem happened. And so it was super intentional, this idea of, well, we're going to cause a drug problem. And then we might as well have, two birds, one stone, use this drug problem as a way to get rid of our other problem, which is the freedom of Black people, and create this mass incarceration system. In the 70s, there were actually, I remember, this is not in the book, but I remember reading in another thing about how people were thinking, hey, maybe we're going to end up just kind of closing all of our prisons because we don't have very many people in them and it doesn't seem like it's that effective. And instead, with the war on drugs, what you ended up having is an explosion in terms of the number of people who were incarcerated. And so it's this thing that was just done with such intentionality to really, completely deprive entire communities of their freedom and their rights. And because of the way that, like you talked about, that loophole in the 13th Amendment, this basically enacts slavery for everybody who's incarcerated. And even once they are freed, their rights are severely limited. You can't vote, and you can't, get federal assistance for things like housing. A lot of places won't even rent housing to you. You often are barred from jobs. I mean, it completely erodes the communities that are affected by it. So it was just so upsetting to read about how intentional all of that was.
Not to mention the whole thing between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. It was severely intentional in the way that they criminalized those drugs, because powder cocaine was more often than not used by white people, so it became this sort of posh yuppie recreational drugs, and you could get slapped to the wrist if you got caught using it. And people could use it in impunity. Like there are whole like sitcoms making fun of 80s drug use, with like suit-wearing white men. Like think Mad Men, for example, and things after that. Like it's so egregious. Whereas crack cocaine was basically branded as being synonymous with the word ghetto and hood, and heavily penalized, even though they are the exact same drug. And one of the other things that was really baffling to me was this idea that this was all about political power. This was all about being able to maneuver who could vote, because this was also the time when there started this rebranding of the Democratic Party. What we haven't mentioned in previous chapters, the Democratic Party was crucial, especially in the South, to legalize the Black codes and the Jim Crow. And then after the Civil Rights Movement, a lot of the Democrats conservative Democrat members actually moved over to the Republican Party. And that's when you start seeing the shift of Democrats becoming the sort of more liberal, more progressive party, which they weren't before. So during this time, you also start to get this narrative that Black people vote for Democrats. So in order to maintain control of the voter pool, it then becomes beneficial for the people in power to decide who gets to vote. And what better way to do that than to incarcerate with impunity and make sure that those people don't have the voting rights.
Yeah. And like you said too before with the dog whistles, there's this coded language of being somebody who, like a president who supports law and order, that being code for, yeah, I want to lock up all of the criminals who are Black people. And so it all just kind of ties in together, and it's pretty bad. And then the last chapter, chapter 5, as well as the afterword, really talk about the modern era. So the era of Obama and then now the era of Trump. And it focuses a lot on the way that especially the GOP has been fighting against political power for the Black community. So in particular, this chapter and the afterword focus a lot on the idea of how the GOP works to remove voting rights. So Reija was just talking about how, a lot of this thing with incarceration and a lot of this is the aim is to remove voting power. And that's really what all of this last chapter talks about too. It talks about how, especially after Obama was elected, where he was elected, especially due to voter turnout, because there were a lot of new voters, a lot of young voters, a lot of non-white voters, a lot of elderly and poor, and all sorts of people who really the GOP does not want to vote because they will not vote Republican. They came out and voted. And so the modern way that the GOP is fighting against Black power is via disenfranchisement. So through voter suppression and through completely disenfranchising as many people as they can. So this chapter just goes through all of the different ways that that has been done. And there's a lot of different ways that they do it. One of the really powerful modern ways that you will hear about, because it's going on right now, is voter ID laws. So voter ID laws are basically where in order to vote, you have to show a government issued ID. And this maybe, especially if you're somebody who has like a government issued ID, doesn't seem so bad, except that this is actually something that is done really to impact people who maybe don't have it, people who live in cities where they don't drive, so maybe they don't have a driver's license, people who are younger because maybe they have a student ID but not a government issued one and that doesn't count, or people who are older, or people who are poor, maybe they just take the bus, these sorts of things. Also, it can be really hard to even get a government issued ID for a lot of people because maybe they don't have access to their birth certificate or the other documentation they need, such as like a W-2. But if you're unemployed, you don't get that. Or something like a utility bill in your name. But if you live in a multi-generational household, you probably don't have one. So it really makes it impossible for such a wide swath of people who are exactly the people that the GOP does not want voting to vote. And the language that they use around this is all about voter fraud. So the GOP claims like, oh, well, we want to have, stricter voter ID requirements so that we can prevent voter fraud. The thing is, voter fraud is like not a thing. People do not engage in voter fraud. It's not a big deal. And the book talked about how really when they looked at it, the only real instances of voter fraud were people who were ex-felons who thought they were eligible to vote again, and it turned out they weren't. And that's the closest thing. You have almost nobody intentionally conducting voter fraud. But on the other hand, you have like hundreds of thousands of people being prevented from voting by these voter ID laws. And there's so many other things that the GOP does as well. They talked about purging voting records, where basically they would send out these like letters to households with a do not forward requirement, which meant that, you know, if that person had moved, then the post office would have to return it, right? And what that means is that anytime they got one of those back, they would say, well, the address for this person is incorrect, so we're purging them from our voting records, which means that those people, without realizing that they have been purged, will go to vote on voting day and be turned away. They'll be told, you cannot vote, you're not registered to vote. And there was an audit that was done in Florida after the election because this was done. They purged like 180,000 voters, and an audit was done afterwards by the Secretary of State that found actually only 85 of those were correctly purged, which means you have almost 180,000 people who were incorrectly removed from the voting polls. And it's just like so egregious. They also do things like limiting the voting locations and hours to make it harder for people to vote, so that they have to go further or they have to wait in excessive lines, like over 6 hours to vote. They do things like limiting early voting so that people who, you know, can't take time off on a Tuesday to go vote, or who can't wait 6 hours to vote, are unable to go a couple days before. Things like there's a lot of Black communities where after church, they would get in a bus and go and vote together on that Sunday, and they would close down that and say, no early voting. Or things like mail-in voting. Especially right now, we're seeing this in the US because COVID is happening. And a lot of people are saying, why can't we do mail-in voting? And the response by a lot of GOP people is, oh, well, because that'll introduce a lot of voter fraud. Where the real reason is, if you allow mail-in voting, you reduce the barriers to getting to vote, which allows more people to vote, which in turn reduces their power. And even other things that are not even restricting voting, but just reducing the power in the vote, such as gerrymandering, where you can draw lines for districts such that it splits up powerful groups. So like, let's say that in a town, in a one district, you have 60% of that district who is going to vote Democrat, right? But if you draw a line down the middle of that and split them where the surrounding areas are heavily Republican, now they just represent 30% in each. And so therefore you can limit the power that they have even when they do vote through gerrymandering. So this chapter just went through all of these different ways. It was so bad. And in addition to, like Reija talked about, the kind of inability for ex-felons to vote in a lot of states, like it talked about Florida, where it's something like 12 or 14 years after you get out of prison. And then even once that time passes, you still have to go through a very tedious, intensive process to get your voting rights reinstated. And the book talked about how 23% of eligible Black voters in Florida cannot vote because of that. And like, it's a huge percentage, especially given how pivotal Florida is in elections. So that's crazy. And the other thing that this chapter talked about that was so infuriating was the 2013 Supreme Court ruling about the Voting Rights Act. It was just infuriating. So basically what happened was the Voting Rights Act had some special rules where states that had, especially southern states, but really any states that had a history of violating voting rights, had special oversight by the federal government, and the federal government could step in and stop what they were doing if they tried to do anything shady. And it basically, a county, I think in Texas, did something shady, but they fought that. They fought the fixing of that all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled, you know, that's outdated. We don't need those extra protections anymore, even though the exact way that the Voting Rights Act worked was that if the states or counties didn't cause any kind of problems in terms of voting, they could get taken off of that special watch list. It's just that so many of them were on it, and like lots of other places got added, like places in Arizona, because they did shady stuff. But the Supreme Court ruling basically said, never mind, we're not going to have any of that oversight. The federal government isn't going to have any ability to step in. And instead, each of these places that anytime there's a violation of voting rights, they're going to have to go and sue for that. They're going to have to take it to court individually, which of course is going to take a long time. It's going to take years. And this is when you've got a lot of the legislation being made immediately before some sort of election happens. And it talked about how there were things like that where you would have complete changes to the polling stations or purges of the voting records or any of these things happen like right before an election. And then the election would happen. And then even if you have people sue against that, the election's already done. You can't fix it. Years later, they might say, okay, well, that, you can't do that anymore, or we have to, roll back that law or whatever, but it doesn't change the results of the election. And so it's just completely made it difficult for anybody to fight against these voting rights violations. And that's just the method that the GOP is using currently to make it so that Black people do not have power politically, because they know that if they allow people to vote, then they won't stay in power. There's even some quotes by some big GOP leaders about how there aren't really enough angry white men to elect us if we don't limit the voting power of other people. And there are still quite a lot of angry white people, and that's what you see with Trump supporters, especially, like, it talked about some crazy stuff with Trump where it was something like 20% of Trump supporters think that slaves never should have been freed. And it's like, wow. The coded language that Reija was talking about is very present. I mean, Make America Great Again is all about saying, like, hey, let's give resources and power back to white people instead of allowing non-whites to have power. And so just the whole modern Southern strategy is disenfranchise, suppress voters, and retain power for those in white.
Okay, so this chapter was really tough for me to read personally, because this chapter, and I'm going to sound very rude saying this, but I don't care, this chapter made me realize that the United States is not a democracy. Because in no country where there is actually a real democratic process of its citizens does this get to happen. And first of all, like, reading about the voter ID law, I was at first kind of surprised. I was like, well, why wouldn't you want voter IDs? Because like in Finland, for example, you need ID to vote. That's just how it works. And every single person tends to carry some sort of ID. But that the ID that we have is also more accessible. You have many different kinds of ID that you can have and that you can use. And they have various forms of payment that, or you have cheaper alternatives against more expensive alternatives, etc. And also this idea of registering to vote or making your party alliance known prior to voting. It's like, this is what I would call a trap in the making, where you are basically creating these barriers for individuals to vote, but you are also entrapping them by creating, not only by creating obstacles, but basically having people have to out themselves with certain party affiliation prior to voting, which then makes it easier to decide where you need to restrict voting more. And I just thought that it is so undemocratic and unethical. And I was so angry reading this chapter. I was like, what in the hell is this? And it also like goes to show that this is America taking the other shotgun to the other foot, where you have this thing where the people in power don't represent the population of the country and the changing demographics of the country, and therefore they can't enact policies that are beneficial for the majority of the country, which then goes to show when the United States is so behind in things like education, housing, and scientific innovation. This is all because of people in power just gripping to that, to their own sense of entitlement and power, and not realizing that they aren't there to serve themselves. They are there to serve the public that elected them. Except in this case, it wasn't even the public that elected them, but a small portion of hand-picked people. And it just made me so incredibly upset and mad. And this chapter was the hardest for me to read. Not that the other chapters weren't hard for me to read, but this one just made something in my core wither with rage.
Yeah, and just as a note to anybody who goes in to read this book, it is intense. It is hard to read. We both really struggled with this, and it was so hard to get through all of this content, even though, I mean, it's very concise. It's not like it's a super long book, but it is hard to get through because it's just so frustrating and so heartbreaking to just see fact after fact after fact of what's going on and realize that it's been bad and it continues to be bad, and without huge change, it will continue for the foreseeable future. I think that this book did a really good job of putting into context just how pervasive racism is and how pervasive oppression of Black people has been, continues to be, and really why people are so upset about it, why it's justified. So I think that this book does such a good job of that. It's just the reality is hard to handle.
I would also say that if you decide to read this book, I would also recommend watching 13th, which is a documentary directed by Ava DuVernay that's available on Netflix, because it goes deeper into the mass incarceration problem. It goes deeper into how the Reagan administration and then the Clinton administration actually made it possible to privatize prisons and essentially reintroduce a new type of black codes, basically, that are currently being used. So yeah, I would recommend that documentary, because I think together this book and that documentary kind of are a very tight package of information on this subject.
Yeah, and if you're not sure if you can handle reading this book, I think that the documentary stands on its own. I mean, it really is a very good documentary, and it covers a lot of the content of this book as well. So that's a great place to start. And if you watch that and then feel like you're able to handle more, then read White Rage. And I think that you'll come in already familiar with at least some of the topics and aware of kind of the depth of what you're going to get into.
To conclude this discussion, I think it also behooves us to really reflect on what is happening currently in the United States. We're kind of living in an era of new civil rights movement, basically, what with the protests and the continued struggle to get violent police officers out of the streets and charged and convicted, and the struggle of Black people to maintain agency in the current political climate. And so in the description, Shannon and I will leave some resources for various causes and to various organizations where you can educate yourself on this matter. And it's important to note that what we are seeing currently is just the echoes of history. Like this is the butterfly effect that is happening right now. Like we are now seeing the results of hundreds of years of legislation and disenfranchisement.
Yeah, so again, this book is definitely something that's really worthwhile. The content is worthwhile. We hope that you will check out 13th or White Rage or some of the resources that we'll link below. If you guys have any thoughts or any comments or any recommendations for us, go ahead and leave them down below. We'd love to hear from you.